You're listening to Big World Network.
Skyfire, Season 2, Episode 1, written and read by Arthur W. Johnson. Seamus had sealed his fate with his letter to his father, and Fahey had accepted it with his reply, stating that Seamus's friend Robin, having nowhere else to turn now that his grandfather was dead, was thankful for the living. Though I wish it were not so, Fahey had concluded, I will accept your feelings about coming home. I miss you, son. Quite often during bouts with his memory, Seamus would wander the half-mile or so along the canal bed to where the last lock was being built in search of solitude. He would sit in the moonlight for a while and stare at the quarried stone dumped haphazardly on the ground, or at the mortared walls made of the same material. The walls often curved back toward the banks, but the mortar joints remained the same, large and coarsely struck by unskilled hands learning the trade. But even though the mortar joints were wide enough for a man to fit his hands into past the wrist, the lines were even and the face of the stone was plumb. He found a small amount of satisfaction in the shape of the stones, and was often fascinated by the images of plants and animals that seemed to appear when the moonlight played across their surfaces. He never saw the locks by daylight because the digging was too far away, but he promised himself that he would visit them one Sunday when he was given free time. The weazened old man working between Seamus and Kyle groaned and dropped his pick. He leaned his shoulder against the embankment and slid to his knees. Seamus dropped his shovel as the old man doubled up and fell sideways. Seamus bent to lend old Hank a hand as Kyle looked around to see if help was nearby. For the love of Christ, Kyle swore between clenched teeth. Here comes Kicker. Seamus felt a shiver rise up his spine as he propped the gray head of the old man on his knee. The man's eyes opened and he looked around. It's my heart, but I think I'll be all right, Hank said in a whisper as he clenched his shirt front over his chest in pain. You'd best get back to work before Tom gets over here. You don't look so good, Hank, Seamus said. Your face is kind of peaked. I'll be all right, the withered mouth insisted. Kyle, get some water, Seamus said. As Kyle strode off toward the bucket, Seamus turned back to the old man. You just relax for a minute. Don't worry about Tom or me right now. Now what are you playing at? Tom roared as he approached. If you want to be a nurse, go somewhere else. If you want to dig canals, stay, but get back to work. Seamus looked around at the gathering crowd, then back at Tom. But Hank collapsed and... Bull! Bellowed Tom. He's just faking it. I'll show you. Without warning, Tom planted the toe of his boot in the old man's ribs with bone-crunching force. Hank's eyes bulged as he sat bolt upright. Tom lashed out with the toe of his boot again, connecting with the same spot in the lower part of his ribs. Blood oozed from the corner of the old man's twisted lips just before he slumped, face first, into the dust, dead. The shock of the brutal moment wore off quickly. Like a breaking wave drags the next wave ashore, rage followed shock as Seamus roared, No! And attacked Kicker with a vengeance he thought he had overcome. Uppercuts, roundhouses, and haymakers were all mixed up in a series of quick movements as the roaring crowd continued to swell. Seamus kept moving around Tom, who seemed too dazed to locate his attacker. In a final fist-flying frenzy, Seamus laid waste to the owner of those specially made kicking boots. Panting from the effort, Seamus sank to his knees and looked with revulsion at the writhing, moaning heap before him. Then he rose and walked away. He rubbed his aching, bloody knuckles as the crowd parted to let him through. He had been oblivious to their cheers as he had pummeled and punished Kicker, and he remained trance-like as he passed through the throng. He saw only the bulging eyes and the bleeding mouth of the old man named Hank, whom he hardly knew, a man in need of a little comfort in his advanced years, who had reaped only the wrath of a sadistic taskmaster. As he stumbled back to his tent, his fury spent, Seamus began to feel shame for having again lost his temper. He heard a cheer from behind and hoped it meant that Kicker was on his feet. He turned and watched the milling circle of men, expecting to see Tom's head, perhaps being helped back to his own tent. He was glad that he had stopped before he killed Tom. His conscience was still raw from the ghost of a similar person back in Athlone, even though years had passed since that fateful day. As he watched, the cheer took on a lusty tone and the crowd parted. A man on horseback galloped out of the crowd with a trail of dust rising behind him. Looking closer, Seamus recognized the familiar boots of Kicker at the leading edge of the dust cloud, tied to a rope that ran up to the rider's saddle. Seamus lowered his head in dismay and continued on to his tent. He sat in silence, listening to the roaring cheers and ripples of laughter up and down the canal bed, especially near the lock construction. He tried to justify the beating he had given Tom by recalling the vision of old Hank's bulging eyes, but instead he kept remembering another fit of rage and its results. How could he justify anything in the events of mankind when he was but one of its members? In disgust with himself and the reactions of his fellow man, he threw his belongings into his bag. He tossed a book into the bag, then retrieved it and sat down, glaring at the title. Praise of Folly leapt off the spine at him, and its title took on a new meaning for him. He could not recall the words Desiderius Erasmus had so carefully penned within that binding, only the act he had committed in the shouts and the laughter of his co-workers as they dragged Tom along behind the horse. He thought of the face of his friend Kyle beaming with glee as he ran bucket sloshing water along with the crowd. Seamus didn't think much of Kicker, but he was appalled at the joy with which the crowd had undertaken his punishments once they had the upper hand, the advantage that he, Seamus, had so shamefully given to them. Such folly, he thought, and they were all praising themselves. He pulled the cords tight on his bag and flung it over his shoulder. With the book in his free hand, he stepped from the tent and met Kyle, who was about to enter. The two stared at each other for what seemed an eternity. Kyle's smile faded when he read the apparent disgust in Seamus's expression. He opened his mouth to speak as Seamus slammed the book into his chest and walked away with only his bag. After some distance, Seamus looked back to see his friend on his knees in the dust, staring at the book's title. As he passed the stone locks, he was not surprised to look up and see a pair of hands protruding from the fresh mortar joint of newly laid masonry. He stopped for a moment to wipe the hot tears from his cheeks as a finger twitched on one of the dangling hands. As the light began to fail, Seamus turned to the west. He walked toward the setting sun with one small, pink cloud floating just above the horizon, one small but insignificant piece of Skyfire. Seamus walked slowly westward for several weeks, sleeping under the stars at night and avoiding the beaten paths by the day. He wanted nothing to do with his own kind and their immorality, but sought the solitude of the forest and the animals. He lived on the abundance of the autumn berries and drank from the unsoiled streams. He began to experience a tranquility he had not known existed, and he relished in the hope that it would go on forever. He was in just such a mood as he followed the course of a river one day, and the sky grew dark with clouds. Rain suddenly descended sharply. He spotted a willow and made a dash for its protection. Feeling secure and somewhat dry with the rain running down the outer limbs and leaves, he let his defenses drop, and at that moment Patricia came to him again. He felt the hot waves of emotion welling behind his eyelids, and he heard the words, "Be safe," but there was more, for the vision pointed past him and said, "Love her as you have loved me, and I will come no more." His heart was torn asunder, for on the one hand he wished to be free of the heartache, but on the other he cherished the memory, and he wished to hold on to Patricia forever. As the vision of her began to fade, he grasped for the vaporous form, but caught only handfuls of wet willow leaves. He slowly turned in the direction her ghost had pointed and saw the startled, white-brown eyes of a maiden who had also entered the willow's protection. He stared in disbelief and she in surprise.
Music by Kevin MacLeod.
You're listening to Big World Network.